Speed and Nguyen's Deep Dive podcast is an official podcast made by Speed and Nguyen with the voice made from Google's Notebook LM. Do not reproduce our podcast without permissions from the owner.
Right.
Welcome to the Speed and Nguyen's Deep Dive podcast.
It's great to be here.
So, I want you to imagine trying to write a law that bans a symbol of hate.
Okay, yeah.
But, like, if you get a single comma wrong, you accidentally turn a museum curator or a peaceful Buddhist monk into a criminal.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a tightrope.
Right. And over the last few years, Australia has been trying to write that exact law.
Yeah.
It's a huge task.
It really is. I mean, trying to outlaw a deeply rooted ideology by outlawing its, visual language, it's honestly one of the most complex legal and social experiments a democracy can undertake.
For sure. So for this deep dive, we're sorting through a massive stack of recent sources. We've got Australian federal and state legislation, police media releases from the AFP, news articles, and this highly detailed 2026 submission from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry.
Right, the ECAJ. Because you're constantly balancing, the absolute necessity of public safety against those fundamental pillars of human rights, like freedom of expression and, of course, freedom of religion.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand exactly where we are in 2026, we have to look back at the first major wave of these bans.
Which was mostly at the state level, right? Around 2022 and 2023.
Exactly. So New South Wales kind of drew the first major line in the sand in August 2022. They specifically banned Nazi symbols.
And these weren't just like a slap on the wrist.
No, definitely not. We're talking up to 12 months in prison or an $11,000 fine.
Which is significant, and then Victoria followed that blueprint in late 2023. But they got a lot more specific with the iconography.
Right, they really drilled down.
Yeah, their legislation explicitly named the Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross, or the Nazi swastika, along with the SS bolts and the Totenkopf.
Wait, what's the Totenkopf again?
It's that specific Nazi skull and crossbones symbol.
Oh, right, I've seen that.
And Victoria's financial penalties were even steeper, up to $23,000. And South Australia was simultaneously pushing very similar frameworks.
So the really fascinating part of diving into these sources is seeing the immediate real-world collision between a well-intentioned law and, well, the sheer historical complexity of human symbols.
Oh, absolutely. The unintended consequences.
Yeah. Like reading the statements from the Hindu Council of Australia in these sources is genuinely moving.
Yeah.
For decades, members of the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain communities felt they just couldn't publicly display their own sacred swastika.
Right, which is a symbol of peace, prosperity, and good fortune.
Exactly. And it predates the Nazi Party by thousands of years. But it had been so viciously co-opted.
Corrupted, really.
Yeah, corrupted. So these new state laws explicitly carved out protections for genuine religious and cultural displays.
Which was a huge relief for them. The Hindu Council actually described this as a liberation. They noted that the law finally freed their sacred symbol from its indoor prison.
Indoor prison. That's such a powerful phrase. It was a monumental victory for those communities to finally reclaim their heritage without fear of, public misunderstanding or legal reprisal.
But on the flip side, writing this legislation is kind of like trying to copyright the alphabet.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You can ban groups from spelling certain hateful words, but you can't ban the letters themselves without silencing everyone else.
And that reality sent historical and military collectors in places like South Australia into an absolute panic.
I can imagine.
Yeah, we reviewed this submission from the Antique and Historical Arms Association of SA, and it really highlights the dread of everyday people who just possessed genuine, valuable collections of World War II memorabilia.
Because suddenly owning a historical German firearm or a period uniform felt like a one-way ticket to court.
Exactly, and it wasn't just private hobbyists freaking out. The History Trust of South Australia, who run major state museums, they had to actively lobby for specific exemptions for educational and historical purposes.
They essentially had to formally argue that displaying these items is vital to taking the public about the horrifying realities of Nazism.
Right, because if you remove them from museums, you essentially erase the physical evidence of that history.
Yeah.
It's like performing open-heart surgery with a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
How do lawmakers even thread this needle? How do you cut out the hate without damaging history and religious freedom?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Lawmakers tried to thread that needle by writing in all these specific exemptions. One for academic use, one for religious displays, artistic purposes.
Makes sense on paper.
It does. But the moment you create an exemption in the law, you create a gray area. And these extremist groups are, frankly, incredibly adept at finding and thriving within those gray areas.
Because they operate on the fringes anyway.
Exactly. They are constantly testing the boundaries of what the state can technically prove in a courtroom.
And that dynamic completely explains the catalyst for the chaos that followed. Because those early state laws left massive jurisdictional loopholes.
They did.
And extremist groups didn't just stumble into them, they actively weaponized them. The sources document this really alarming rise of the National Socialist Network, the NSN.
Right. Formed in 2020.
Yeah, by Thomas Sewell. And he essentially merged two distinct far-right groups. The Lads Society, which was almost like this nationalist fight club focused on physical intimidation, and Antipodean resistance.
Which was much more of a covert, highly radicalized youth movement, really obsessed with internet propaganda.
So you combine street-level brawlers with internet-savvy propagandists.
And you get a highly volatile organization.
Yeah, the escalation was rapid and terrifying for the targeted communities. In 2021, dozens of members traveled to the Grampians National Park in Victoria. They allegedly burned a cross and intimidated locals.
In what is usually a peaceful, remote tourist destination, it was a clear signal that they were willing to mobilize in the physical world.
And the brazenness just kept escalating. March 2023, they hijacked the steps of Victoria's parliament during a rally organized by Kelly Japine. They were performing Nazi salutes right in the open for the news cameras.
It's wild to think about.
Then, October 2023, they executed this highly coordinated intimidation tactic at Flinders Street Station in Melbourne.
This was the escalator incident, right?
Yes.
Wait.
Dozens of masked men riding the escalators doing Roman salutes. They boarded a public train and literally interrogated trapped passengers, asking if they were Jewish while handing out racist flyers.
Unbelievable. And that Flinders Street train incident fundamentally shifted the public consciousness. It demonstrated a level of highly organized, mobile intimidation.
Which the existing fragmented state laws were completely struggling to contain.
Exactly. It forced politicians to realize that a localized approach was fundamentally broken.
But wait, looking at these timelines, the obvious question you have to ask is, how? If these symbols and salutes are banned, how is a group repeatedly marching in plain sight, even showing up at Australia Day rallies in Sydney and Adelaide well into 2024 and 2025? Like, why weren't there immediate mass arrests?
The answer lies in the mechanics of how they organize these events. So Victoria, unlike New South Wales, lacked a strict preemptive protest permit system.
Oh, I see.
So the NSN exploited this by organizing what we call flash rallies.
Meaning they don't announce their presence to the authorities beforehand.
Right. They use encrypted messaging apps like Telegram to coordinate a specific drop point. They swarm a location, unfurl their banners, throw up the salutes to get the exact photographs they need for their online propaganda.
And then they completely scatter before the police can even arrive in force.
Exactly. And furthermore, even if police were present, the officers on the ground had to untangle the legalities in real time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, trying to figure out the law on the street.
Yeah, assessing whether a specific banner crossed the legal threshold or if the individuals might try to claim an artistic or political exemption. The NSN manipulated the slow gears of the legal system and the fast pace of the media at the exact same time.
It's honestly a masterclass in exploiting bureaucracy. And because the federal government realized that this state-by-state patchwork was basically a legal sieve, they decided to completely change the game.
They had to.
Yeah. Frustrated by this endless cat-and-mouse dynamic, the federal government and law enforcement dropped a massive legislative hammer in late 2025.
Right. The Criminal Code Amendment, the Hate Crimes Bill of 2025, it overhauled the federal approach in two major ways.
Break that down for us.
First, it expanded the umbrella of protections. So the law no longer just covered race and religion. It explicitly included protections against hate crimes based on sex, sexual orientation, and disability.
Okay.
But the most revolutionary change was altering the fundamental threshold required for a conviction.
Because previously, prosecutors had the agonizing task of proving that a person intended to cause violence by displaying a symbol or making a statement.
Which is incredibly difficult. Proving what is going on inside someone's head in a court of law, almost impossible.
Yeah, a defendant could just stand up and claim it was an edgy joke that went wrong.
Right. But the 2025 bill eliminated that defense by lowering the legal threshold to recklessness.
Wait, recklessness is a fascinating legal standard.
Come on.
So that means the prosecution no longer has to read the extremist's mind to prove they wanted to start a riot.
Exactly. They just have to prove that any reasonable person walking down the street would know a riot or violence was a highly likely outcome of their actions.
Wow.
Yeah, if a reasonable person would look at your behavior and recognize a substantial risk of inciting violence, you can be convicted. Your internal intention or your claim of ignorance becomes legally irrelevant.
And to back this up, the federal government also introduced severe mandatory minimum sentences, right?
Yes, guaranteeing at least 12 months in prison for displaying Nazi or prohibited terrorist symbols.
Here's where it gets really interesting. With those new legal tools, law enforcement completely shifted their operational strategy.
They went on the offensive.
Yeah, the Australian Federal Police, specifically their National Security Investigations Teams, the NSI, they stopped just showing up at protests for crowd control. In December 2025, they launched a massive coordinated blitz aimed at counter-logistics.
Disrupting the supply chains.
Exactly. They started actively taking down the networks that feed these groups.
And that NSI blitz fundamentally disrupted the extremists' infrastructure. Like, in Queensland, they raided the home of a 43-year-old UK citizen who had been prolific at posting Nazi symbols on the platform X.
And it wasn't just tweets. During the raid, they seized physical caches of weapons, swords bearing swastikas, axes, and knives.
Right, they weren't just going after the loud guys on the street anymore.
Yo, they arrested a 21-year-old who was acting as a logistical hub, importing significant quantities of extremist flags and literature from overseas suppliers.
And when a man in Sydney decided to test the new waters by performing a Nazi salute at a public gathering, he was immediately charged, triggering that brand new mandatory 12-month minimum sentence.
Oh.
Yeah, the combination of mandatory minimals and the recklessness standard fundamentally altered the risk calculus for these movements. The federal government sent a definitive message. Playing games with legal loopholes was over. The cost of participation was now guaranteed prison time.
But because the federal government essentially plugged the physical and logistical loopholes, organizations representing the targeted communities realized the battleground was just going to shift.
Right, toward intellectual and religious loopholes.
Exactly. That's why in early 2026, we see this massive push to tighten the net even further. Which brings us to the detailed submission dated January 15, 2026, from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the ECAJ.
Right, and they were addressing the absolute newest piece of proposed legislation, the Combatting Antisemitism, Hate and Extremism Bill 2026.
And just to be clear for you listening, we're simply reporting on the viewpoints in the ECAJ's submission to the parliamentary committee here. We're impartially outlining their arguments to understand where experts believe the legal vulnerabilities still lie.
Exactly, we're just looking at what they submitted.
So the ECAJ is essentially arguing that while the 2025 laws were a good start, they need more teeth. They are pushing for the 12-month mandatory minimum sentence to be doubled to a full 2 years.
But the most intense part of their submission, I think, focuses on a specific clause in the proposed 2026 bill regarding a religious teaching exemption.
Yeah, the ECAJ views the religious teaching exemption as an incredibly dangerous vulnerability. They cite a specific high-profile federal court case, Wertheim v. Haddad.
Right. And in that case, deeply anti-Semitic statements, specifically public speeches referring to Jewish people as descendants of apes and pigs, were defended in court on the grounds that they were genuine religious quotes.
And therefore part of a protected theological discussion. So the ECAJ is pointing out a terrifying loophole. If a hate group figures out that they can mask their ideology as a quote-unquote theological discussion, they can use religious freedom laws as an impenetrable shield against hate speech laws.
It's essentially weaponizing tolerance against itself.
Yeah, and the ECAJ argues forcefully that no recognized religion knowingly promotes violence or hatred of entire communities based on race. Therefore, invoking religious texts as an excuse to publicly dehumanize people shouldn't be a legally protected act.
Consequently, they're also demanding the total removal of the good faith defense when a person is accused of the intentional promotion of racial hatred.
And they aren't just looking at religious loopholes. They want to radically expand the actual definition of what counts as a hate symbol.
Right. They argue the law needs to capture symbols that are customarily used by hate groups, even if they aren't, like the official logo on the letterhead.
Yeah, they explicitly point to the inverted red triangle, a symbol heavily associated with Hamas, and argue that parading portraits of known terrorist leaders should trigger the exact same legal penalties as flying a swastika.
But, this raises an important question.
Which is?
How does a secular, democratic legal system balance the absolute freedom of religion against the absolute right of a community to live without fear of targeted, coded incitement?
Right. If you remove the religious teaching exemption, don't you risk prosecuting genuine theological discussions?
Exactly. If a sacred text contains an ancient, hateful passage, at what point does quoting it cross the line from archaic theology into criminal incitement? It is a point of severe legal friction.
It is an incredibly thorny philosophical debate. But while the politicians, lawyers, and community leaders were debating these complex legal theories in January 2026, something really dramatic happened on the ground.
The climax of our sources.
Yes. Right as these new federal hate laws were passing through Parliament, the National Socialist Network, the group responsible for the Grampians cross-burning and the Flinders Street train intimidation, officially announced on Telegram that they were disbanding.
Wow. And the group explicitly cited the new federal hate speech laws as the catalyst for their dissolution.
Oh, so the laws actually worked.
Well, the leadership realized that because the legal threshold had been lowered to recklessness and because mandatory minimum sentences were now in play, they just couldn't operate a formal, visible network anymore, not without exposing every single member to immediate imprisonment.
The legal risk simply became too high to maintain their organizational structure. So you read that announcement and think, okay, the legislation finally crushed the extremist movement.
Aye.
But the sources reveal a massive plot twist. The formal organization shattered, sure, but the ideology simply shapeshifted. We see that immediately when former NSN members like Brandon Koshel were still arrested on Australia Day 2026, charged with inciting hatred for a public speech.
And what is truly fascinating from a sociological perspective is how quickly the remnants of that network adapted their visual language.
They pivoted so fast.
Yeah, when the government banned the swastika, the SS bolts, and the Totenkopf, these individuals immediately began adopting incredibly obscure symbols that aren't technically outlined in any criminal code yet.
They essentially invented a new alphabet of hate.
They really did.
They started adopting ancient Futhark runes, drawing on that mythic Norse aesthetic that white supremacists often use to invent this, like, glorious ancient past.
And they started using images of the Sutton Hoo helmet.
Right, which is this iconic haunting iron and bronze face mask from a 7th century Anglo-Saxon ship burial. They stripped it of its real historical context and turned it into a subtle dog whistle for white supremacy.
They also leaned heavily into numerical codes, specifically the number 88, which is used globally as a numerical stand-in for Hail Hitler.
And perhaps most bizarrely, they co-opted specific, everyday corporate logos.
Oh, yeah.
The sources note they began wearing the Norwegian outdoor clothing brand Helly Hansen, utilizing the brand's HH logo as a hidden in plain sight stand-in for their ideology.
It's wild.
So what does this all mean? We've traced this massive, multi-year arc for you. We watched the government move from handing out state-level fines to watching extremists exploit legal gray areas to hold flash rallies to unleashing massive federal police raids that disrupt supply chains, which ultimately forced a major neo-Nazi group to officially disband.
A huge journey.
But at the end of the day, it seems like while a well-written law can shatter a specific organization's logistics, the underlying ideology just mutates like a virus. It requires constant, exhausting vigilance from lawmakers just to keep up.
It absolutely does, and it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought to consider.
Yeah.
If hate groups can easily bypass years of rigorous legal drafting simply by adopting a new number, an obscure medieval artifact, or like an innocent outdoor clothing brand to signal their allegiance, at what point does the law reach the absolute limit of what it can control? How do we as a society effectively combat a deeply rooted, hateful ideology when banning its language just forces it to invent a completely new vocabulary?
See you again in the next episode of this podcast.